Thank you very much for coming to LES's first integrated resource planning meeting of 2022. I'm Scott Benson, I'm the manager of resource and transmission planning. That is about as exciting as it sounds. We plan for all of LES's future generating assets as well as the transmission to both serve those assets and LES's load area. Real quick show of hands, how many people have been to an IRP meeting before? Okay, redo. If you're LES staff, please don't raise your hands, okay? How many people have been to an IRP meeting before? Okay, give them a quick round of applause because, and after we get done tonight, especially when I'm done talking, you'll know why. Okay, they heard it and they came back. Very good. So real quick safety briefing for everybody, okay? If it's needed, we have a fire extinguisher and an AED right over there in the corner. Jason, can you raise your hand? It's right behind Jason there, okay? Anybody in the room who is certified to provide CPR in case we need it, raise those hands so you know where they're at. Who wants to be the designated person to call 911? Shelly, very good. And then finally, should we have any severe weather? It looks like we should be pretty good through the meeting, but if we're not, we're gonna go right out here to our left to the men's and women's bathrooms. All right, LES staff will take you right where you need to go, right around the corner. All right, we've also got some people, I believe, online tonight. So if you've got questions throughout, go ahead, put them in the chat or raise your hand. We'll stop at an opportune point and get your questions answered. As we're going through, I'm going to talk a little bit, then Mark Scholnick's going to come up and talk. We are both very informal if you know us. If you've got a question on a slide at hand, you don't have to wait till we get done. All right, you go ahead, get our attention. We'll make sure you get it asked, get it answered, and then we'll move on. Sound good? All right. Okay, what I am going to do is take you through what is an integrated resource plan. We're going to kind of set the stage for what's to come over the next few months. Now, when we do an IRP, we actually fulfill some requirements. The first is Nebraska state law. Every utility in Nebraska is required to perform integrated resource planning. Look at a bunch of different resource options, plan for the future, and try to meet those needs at the lowest cost. We also are required to do integrated resource planning through our hydroelectric contract with the Western Area Power Administration, a federal agency that we buy hydroelectric power from, okay? Now, Wapa says the same thing. Everybody, all their members, all their customers have to do an integrated resource plan, but they have to do it every 5 years, okay? What you'll find is both of them basically requiring the same thing, but the Wapa requirements much more prescriptive. So everything we're going to talk about today is going to be those Wapa hydroelectric requirements, because if we meet those, we're okay with state statute. Now the big question, I don't know why we have a black box up there covering the title, but I'll tell you what it says. What is an IRP? Okay, well, per Wapa, an IRP means you're going to look out in the future and you're going to look at all your various resource options, both supply side like generation and demand side, things you're doing on the customer side of the meter, to make sure you can adequately and reliably serve your customers' future energy needs, right? So we look out there in the future at all those different resource options, and what does that include? Well, we could go out and we could add generating capacity, all right? We could do that through power purchases. We don't do that so often anymore now that we're part of a regional electricity market called the Southwest Power Pool, but we could do that. We can also go and do energy efficiency and conservation. We're able to do cogeneration and district heating and cooling. And then finally, we can do renewable resources. And all this stuff, if you're interested, these slides are going to get posted tomorrow on les.com/IRP. Make me nervous when you're standing over there. So you can go in and look at it. And all these, you'll see it down at the bottom. We've got a link right out to state statute, or in this case, right out to the Wapa regulations. You can go and read it. But pretty much all of this is just a direct quote right from there. So the one thing you'll notice about that list, there's a lot of overlap, right? I could go out and add, let's say, a wind resource that would count as obviously renewable energy. It would count as a power purchase if we did it through a contract, and it would count as new generating capacity, all right? The buckets don't really matter. The point is you consider all of your various options. Now, when you do this, you also have to make sure that you can operationally serve the system, keep the lights on in simple terms. And how do you do that? You've got to account for things like diversity in your resource mix. You've obviously got to look at reliability. And then you've got to look at dispatchability. Dispatchability means resources I can control to balance out the load in the generation because they got to balance all the time. And then the other big thing is Wapa says you've got to look at those energy efficiency options. But there's two things with that you have to keep in mind. The first is you have to have a methodology for how you estimate how much load you're actually deferring. Because if you run a generator, you can meter it and see how much power is coming out. But if you turn off a load, you have no idea what would have been there. So you have to do estimates. And they said estimates are fine. You just got to have a good methodology so you're not kind of making wild estimates. And then the big one is when you evaluate demand side resources like energy efficiency, you have to evaluate them on a level playing field with generation. All right. With generation, you say, hey, I've got extra load. I'm going to add generation to serve it. With energy efficiency, you say, you know what? If I can defer a little bit of that load, that's generation I don't have to add. Two different ways to get to the same place, but you've got to evaluate them together. And we appear to be stuck. I wish, Don. So guys, I can't advance the slides. Okay, I got it now. All right, thank you, Kelly. Okay.
Box is still there.
So what's required? I think we're not gonna try to get rid of the box anymore after that last step. So what's required of the RFP or the IRP when we do this per Wapa? All right. Well, some of this we already talked about. First, you got to look at an entire slew of resources, all the supply side and demand side things that you think are practical. All right. Then you have to have an action plan. What are you going to do in the near term? When we do an IRP, we're looking out 2 decades in the future, but you come up with an action plan for the near term. You can set how long that is. We'll talk about that, but you have to have one. Okay. Then you've got to talk about how you're going to minimize any adverse environmental impacts from generation you're going to add. How are you going to meet all the different regulations to make sure that you don't cause too many problems? You've also got to go through and have a public process. The IRP, as you can see tonight, very interactive, all right? We want to share with you what we're working through, what are the challenges. We want your input and your feedback on that process. And then finally, you've got to conduct load forecasting. Load forecasting just means we're going to look out in the future and see how much load growth do we think we're going to have, because that's the target for how much generation we have to come up with. So the next thing we look at is what's the primary deliverable of the IRP? That's that action plan. Now, LES, we do what most Wapa customers do. We look out 5 years in the future. You can look out with your action plan as far out as you want, but 5 years kind of makes sense because you do an IRP every 5 years, right? So you say, okay, I'm going to set an action plan for the next 5 years because about the time that action plan is running out, voila, I do another IRP, reset the table, take a new look, okay? We also have to do an annual update to Wapa where we look at our action plan from last IRP, all the different things we said we would do. We tell them, do we meet that? Are we close? Where are we at? Now, when you do this action plan, you're looking at things that you said you're going to do for sure, or there could be things you're going to continue doing, and there could be things that you're going to evaluate where you say, you know what? We looked at this in the IRP. It looks like a good idea. We need a little bit more time to look at it, so we're going to evaluate that going forward. So let me give you some examples by what came out of the 2017 IRP, the last time we did this. The first one was a big one. Back in 2017, LES's contract for hydroelectric power from, again, Wapa, that was coming up for renewal in 2017. So we asked Wapa, can we have a little more time based on the schedule they've given us to evaluate that as part of our IRP? And for sure, they said, absolutely, right? That's what we want you to do. And so we evaluated it, looked at it over a number of different futures, and that was a great resource for LES under most future scenarios. So we decided to exercise that contract extension, sign that, and that actually just kicked in last year. It covers 2021 to 2050, 30 years. So that's a big commitment. That was a big thing came out of the IRP. Another one is continuing our sustainable energy program. How many people have heard of the sustainable energy program before, or SCP? All right, very good, very good. Very good for 2 reasons, because this time none of the staff raised their hands. Thank you, people. So that is, for those of you who don't know, it's the umbrella of LES's energy efficiency programs. Those things we work with our customers to try to defer that peak load. So we decided, you know what, we're going to continue that. That's a good program for us. We also said we're going to implement a new program to control the load from air conditioners because our peak is usually set late in the afternoon or early evening in July or August, and one of the big drivers is air conditioning load. Well, we actually rolled forward. That turned into a program called Peak Rewards. Anybody in the room signed up for Peak Rewards? Show of hands. All right, a couple of you. We rolled that out in 2018 because of what we looked at in the IRP. Question?
I tried to sign up for that, but evidently my brand of control was not hooked up to it or wouldn't work with it. Any thought of helping me get one that would qualify?
So the question was, just for the people at home, we have a gentleman here who tried to sign up for Peak Rewards, and his brand of thermostat was not on the list that's supported, which does happen because there's a limited number that are on there. It's not an infinite list. We can have somebody work with you afterwards, catch us after the meeting, right? But that is something that people are going to run into depending on what their brand is. We're trying to add stuff all the time, grow that list, but that's going to be an issue. But we can work with you. So under Peak Rewards, what LES does is we give you an incentive so that early in the afternoon on what might be our peak day in the summer months, we lower the set point in your home or your business, your air conditioning set point, drop your temperature so that a couple of hours later, when we think we're going to hit our peak demand, hopefully your air conditioner rides through that period and doesn't need to run. Pretty cool program. Came out of the IRP. We had another one we looked at. We had a customer. So this customer shall remain nameless, Kurt Donaldson. Kurt came to an IRP meeting just like this. I think it was the first one, and said, you know what? You should look at heat pump water heaters. Those are a really cool blend of two technologies. And so we did. And we came out of the IRP and said, you know what? Those look like they would probably work for us. We think we can do an incentive program, but we're going to evaluate it. And in 2019, we offered that incentive for the first time. So thank you very much, Kurt. And then finally, we have looked at a lot of things with electric vehicles, and the last one, what it might do to our load growth and such. I would say the results of the sensitivity weren't that exciting because what it meant is if you added a bunch of EVs, it meant more load growth. So you added the same resources, you just added them a few years earlier. But the neat thing was we saw the impact they could have. So back in 2017, we said, we have to get a handle on this. We're going to evaluate doing something to try to understand how our customers are driving them, how they're charging them, and how it impacts the LES grid. What came out of that was an EV study that ran from 2019 to 2021, where we collected a lot of different data off customers' vehicles by essentially plugging a little dongle in, which was an electric meter inside their car. We knew when they drove that vehicle, when they charged it, where they charged it, because it was GPS enabled, and most importantly, how much energy it consumed. So all neat things that came out of the 2017 IRP. I can't tell you for sure what will come out of this one because we haven't ran it yet, but you expect those kind of items. This is a little known fact for a lot of people if you haven't been through this before. We talk all the time about LES and our integrated resource plan. We're not the only people that are in the book when we get this report done. We actually have some people we work with called the Lincoln Cooperative. It is all the various Wapa customers that are here in Lincoln. So you have LES, you have the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, and then you have the state of Nebraska in 3 different facilities. You have the Lincoln Regional Center, the Nebraska State Office Building, and the State Penitentiary. Wapa lets us work together to do that. Now, I will tell you, as we go through the process, everything we talk about is obviously LES focused. When you get the big report at the end, if you go look at 2017, 90% of that is LES. But that makes sense because on behalf of those other customers, we take their Wapa contingent of generation, we take it to the Southwest Power Pool market, we supply the rest of their energy needs. So it kind of makes sense that we're the middleman. We go ahead and write the report. The state has already told us that they would like to handle the cooperative again with us this year. UNL, we're waiting for their answer, but we assume they're going to say, yes, we'd like to work with LES. Now, if you get in the report, I will tell you, 2017 is going to be the same this year. There, even though most of the report is LES, there is a section in there where they both talk about their future load forecast. And most importantly, if you read the action plan, there's a section for LES, there's a section for UNL, and there's a section for the state. So they supply us what their action plan items are. We just publish them in the report. Yes.
The city of Lincoln somehow in on this or not really?
So the question was, is the city of Lincoln a part of this? And they are not. And that is because this is a requirement of Wapa customers, which the city of Lincoln is not a Wapa customer. Now, they're involved because LES is officially part of the city, but no, the city of Lincoln proper is not in on this because they're not a Wapa customer. I think I had another question somewhere. Yes, sir.
So do each of these parties generate electricity, or is all electricity coming from LES? What's the relationship other than the reporting?
So UNL does have some equipment on site, but for the most part, it's a reporting tool. If you read all their stuff, it's going to mostly be focused on the energy efficiency side. Although they do talk about, we might put in some roof mounted solar maybe on different facilities. But as far as the large generation components, those are all on the LES piece of the report.
So is it because they're government bodies and large government bodies that they're separated out, or what's the reason they exist as separate clients?
So again, it's because they have a contract with WAPA for federal hydroelectric power, just the same way LES does. So this is everybody in the Lincoln area that has a contract with WAPA. So like we talked before, I believe, WAPA, Western Area Power Administration, they're a federally run agency that has a series of dams all over the middle part of the country. Ours are mostly to the north and east of us, and we get hydroelectric power from those facilities. Okay, good questions. All right. So how's the IRP going to factor in LES's new decarbonization goal? Another show of hands. How many people know about LES's decarbonization goal? All right, very good. For those of you who may not, back in 2020, the LES Administrative Board adopted a new decarbonization goal that LES is going to achieve net zero carbon dioxide emissions from its entire generation portfolio by 2040. Okay, one of the more aggressive decarbonization goals in the country to date. So the question comes up, well, how's that going to get factored into the IRP? And it's actually two ways. One is on the front end, one's on the back end. So on the front end side, you can imagine if we're going to do an analysis to look at all the different resource options that we could use to meet our future load demands. Well, obviously that's going to be an input, right? Because if you're going to decarbonize by 2040, we've got to use that to guide that analysis. But it's also going to come out on the back end. Now the IRP is not going to have enough foresight to look ahead and say, you know what? Here's all the things we're going to do to decarbonize by 2040, and here's when they're going to happen. Too many things are going to happen in the next 2 decades. But we do expect out of this IRP, some of the fundamental building blocks that we're going to use to achieve that goal, we're going to identify those, okay? We're not going to be able to put the whole puzzle together from this one IRP, but I think by the time we're done, you'll be able to see some of the puzzle pieces that we think are going to carry us to the end. So that'll be an interesting thing to watch because we haven't had to do that before. Okay. So then it's a good thing I remember my titles because we'd all be in trouble, all right? So what are some of the limitations of the IRP? The IRP is a really broad analysis. I told you we do it every 5 years. It takes a ton of work. We do most of it in-house. It's supplemented by some consultants. We'll look at that. It's a great study, but it's one study at one point in time. Honestly, the IRP doesn't have a really long shelf life. We don't get too far into 2023 when a big decision's in front of us that we no longer reference the IRP. We go and rerun the study. We're constantly running studies like this, probably not as broad as the IRP. You're more focused on the decision at hand, the real options that are on the table. But we're always running analysis because the world is always changing. Future is never clear. That becomes one of the limitations. The IRP, there's a lot of things that won't foresee because we don't know some of the changes that are coming. So I got some examples for you. Back in 2015, LES went commercial with 273 megawatts of wind. That was spread over 3 different wind projects in 3 different states. They went commercial over the span of 3 months. We didn't see that coming back when we did the IRP before that. That would have been the 2012. Why was that? Well, there's a lot of things that led to LES adding that wind. One was there are federal tax credits that are very lucrative for wind projects. And when we added one of those wind projects, the federal tax credits were expiring. And when we added the second 2, they were expired and gone. And because the federal tax credits were gone, we were pretty certain we were going to buy wind at prices that wouldn't be seen for a long time in the future. The other thing is the EPA come out with what was called the Clean Power Plan. Anybody remember the Clean Power Plan when it got talked about? Those 3 wind projects put LES 100% in compliance with the Clean Power Plan through its last year, which at the time I think was around 2030. We didn't plan to put all that wind in because we didn't see all those things happening. Now, as it turns out, the tax credits that were gone, the federal government a year later brought them back retroactively. The Clean Power Plan, those of you that raised your hands, you know the Clean Power Plan also went away. So the timing didn't turn out as well as we thought, but that was the impetus for adding the wind. In 2016, LES added the first utility scale or large scale solar project in the state of Nebraska. We didn't see that coming either. We knew we were looking at solar, but we didn't know how quickly the cost would come down to where we thought it was time to move on a project and get some experience with it. And then the last one, LES actually exited the Sheldon Station coal contract in 2017. We had a life of plant contract with the Nebraska Public Power District. And life of plant means you're in the contract for as long as the facility's there. But back around 2017, Nebraska Public Power District started talking to the Monolith folks. I know some of you have heard about them. Looked at potentially moving Sheldon Station over to an alternate fuel like hydrogen, which is not what was covered in our contract. So it gave us the opportunity to exit that contract. Why did the IRP see that or didn't see it? Because back when we were doing the IRP, even NPPD probably didn't know there was going to be a company like Monolith to come along. So the IRP is a great study. We've already talked about it. It's going to identify some really big things that are going to shape our future for decades to come. But it's not the end all be all. It's one study at one time, and there's going to be a lot of things that come up in the next few years that we're going to have to evaluate on their own because we can't do it today because we don't know they exist yet. Okay, last thing for my part, because I'm boring you to death, is what's the IRP timeline? So now we're going to talk through everything we're going to do throughout the entire year, right? First, we're going to focus on the stuff that LES has to do. And you want to keep your eye on the little target there in November, right around Thanksgiving. That is when our IRP is due to Wapa. Everybody's got different dates depending on when you signed your contract, but that's the one for LES. So we worked with a couple of consultants. We just got done with that. The first is we worked with a consultant to look at an SPP rule that is based on what they call their effective load carrying capability, or ELCC. We're going to get more into this over the next coming weeks, but ELCC is the way the Southwest Power Pool gives you credit for non-dispatchable resources like wind, solar, and battery storage. It's an important part of our considerations as we go forward. The other is we worked with a consultant to do a review of our sustainable energy program, that umbrella of energy efficiency programs. Back in the 2017 IRP, we did that. Before the IRP, we worked with a consultant to do a deep dive into SCP, make sure we're using the right input assumptions, make sure our tests for measuring success are correct, make sure we're offering the right kind of programs for our territory. We did that again because it worked out so well. We decided, you know what, we're going to do that again before the IRP. And we're going to talk about that with Mark tonight. In parallel to that, LES has been working on developing the model to evaluate all those resources. That takes a lot of work. That is the one thing that we try to only do every 5 years because it literally takes us months to pull together. If something big happens in the world, a lot of the assumptions change, we will reload the data. But if not, we try to do that just for the IRP. So we've been putting that together. So then we have 2 rounds of analysis. The first is looking at the sustainable energy program, taking the input and the feedback the consultant gave us and looking at what we should change of that program going forward. The second, that's the IRP analysis where we look at all the different resources at our disposal and map out what we might want to use in the future, especially in that near-term action plan. The order here is really important. Notice we evaluate and look at the changes we might implement for the sustainable energy program first. Second, we do the full IRP analysis. The reason is, what does WAPA require? They require us to evaluate generation resources and energy efficiency at the same time on an equal playing field. So we figure out how we may change SCP going forward so we can fully evaluate it against all the other options in the IRP. Then we go through and we put together a great big report. You can go and look at the 2017 one out on les.com/IRP. That's all there. We get it all drafted up and a full draft goes out for everybody. By coming tonight, or anybody who comes to any other IRP stuff, or if you send us an email, if you call and ask about it, you show any interest in the IRP at all, when that draft report is done, you will get a personal email from me that has a link to it so you can go and look at it. And we take your feedback. Believe me, our group goes through that report many, many times to get it perfect. and we send it out, and customers like you every year point out all kinds of things that we didn't quite have right, but that's good, makes the report better. Then we get to the public side, and this is where we're at tonight. So notice there's 2 dots up there, okay? The orange one, that's the LES Administrative Board meeting. The green, that's this public meeting tonight. Every time we have a public meeting, we meet with the LES board, go through the materials we're going to cover with the public, and then a week later, we had the public meeting, all right? That one, we're covering this kind of IRP FAQ or a 101. Mark's going to come up next. He's going to tell you about the Sustainable Energy Program, how it works, a little bit of the history, and then he's going to tell you what did the consultant give us for feedback looking forward. Then in May, we're going to have a hands-on interactive workshop. I know there's at least one person in here, Ken, I think has been in this workshop before from the customer side. It's actually a lot of fun. What we're going to do there is we're going to teach you some of the Southwest Power Pool's rules and how they run their electricity markets. You can understand how that stuff impacts our resource decisions. If you can come to that, I guarantee you 2 things. You'll learn a lot about the Southwest Power Pool, and as crazy as this sounds, you're going to laugh while you're there, okay? You're going to have a good time. You might laugh at me, but you're going to laugh, all right? Then we have a midpoint check-in. In this one, we look at the SCP and we say, hey, what came out of that SCP analysis? What things do we think we're going to change about the Sustainable Energy Program? Then we also set the stage for what's the scope of that IRP study to come. What that big resource study, what's that going to be built upon? What are some of the assumptions? What are the outputs going to look like? Set the stage for that discussion. And then finally, for those people that can't make the workshops, we're going to do a quick rundown of those, just give them enough to be dangerous so they can kind of keep up with the group as we go through it. That's both the workshop we just completed on SPP and the next one we're going to have on that effective load carrying capability. The Southwest Power Pool's rules for giving you credit for non-dispatchable resources like wind, solar, and energy storage. At this one, part of it, I'll apologize right up front, is classroom session where I kind of stand here and teach you some of the stuff. The fun part is afterwards, we're going to have a standalone computer network. You can get on that. We've got a model that lets you build LES's resource mix, and you get to see how those rules impact your decisions. So a lot of fun. And finally, we come back in August, and that's really the big meeting. There we talk about the results of that IRP analysis, and we also go through the 5-year action plan. That is when we release the report, so everybody's got all the material. And then for 2 months, we're looking for everybody's feedback. And again, you can email that to us. You can call in and talk to us. You can get a hold of us and say, hey, I would like to come in and meet with you. All that is perfect fine. One of the really fun things we do though, is in these next 2 months, we say, hey, if you represent a group or an organization and enough of those folks are interested in the IRP, you let us know, schedule us, we'll come out to your meeting, all right? Come out and talk to you. If you're a glutton for punishment, I'll even bring Mark with me, all right? And we will go through all this stuff in detail with your group. It keeps you from having to come and talk to us individually. We're doing all that work so that hopefully we can take it to the LES board in October, get the report approved, all finalized. So all the typos and stuff that folks point out to us, we fix all those, give the board a rundown of what we had to change since the draft came out. Also, we can get it submitted to Wapa in November. That is what we're getting ready to go through. Again, thank you all for coming to the kickoff meeting tonight. Before I hand it off to Mark to talk about the SCP stuff, any questions on this IRP kind of 101? Yes, ma'am.
IRP every 5 years is a really good idea, even though it's a lot. Would you still do it if it wasn't required by law?
So I get that question all the time. The question was, if WAPA didn't require us to do the IRP, would we still do it? I'll tell you a funny story, and I can tell this because my staff is in here. Remember when I told you back in 2017, as part of the IRP, we evaluated whether to continue the WAPA contract, correct? At that point, my crack staff said, so if we don't continue this contract, does it mean we can quit doing IRPs? You know what? The answer is no. You would always do it, right? Would it have to be exactly on a 5-year schedule and exactly all the things that WAPA said to consider? Probably not. At a high level, would it be any different? No. Like I said, we do IRP level work all the time, every year. It just gets a lot broader when you do the full-blown one. But yes, even if it wasn't required, we would continue to do them because they're a staple of knowing how we get the right resource mix for our customers. Yes, Ken.
Scott, Two things in my mind. One is this, the net zero by 2040, but the other is the Lincoln's climate action plan. How do, I know you can't go into great detail on this right now, but how do you see those two fitting together? And should they, or are they separate things going their own way?
Okay, so Ken's question was in regards to the city of Lincoln's climate action plan, 80% reduction by 2050, and how that, or if that ties into LES's net zero by 2040. They are two separate plans. LES obviously is working our plan, right? But there's no doubt they're tied together, because if you look at a large component of what the city's counting on to achieve their 80% reduction by 2050 is LES achieving our net zero by 2040. So because of the way the timelines work, and that electricity obviously is something that all the customers of the city use, right? If we can pull off our goal, it feeds into helping the city achieve theirs. It doesn't do everything. There's a little broader than ours, but it definitely takes them a long ways down that path. So good question. Anybody else before we hand off to Mark? Yes.
You probably mentioned this, but I didn't catch it. The time period for the 5-year plan, 2023 to 2028, what's the actual time period plan we'll be looking at?
So we will start our study if 2022 is typically so this year would be the base year. But yes, we'll be looking at that 5-year period. So you've got that right. Our next one will be technically in 2027 to set the next 5 years. Okay. Yes.
There is a Nebraska municipal power pool. How does that coordinate, or do they run parallel, or are they doing the same thing?
Yes. So there is a Nebraska municipal power pool. They're a Wapa customer. They have to go through an IRP similar to LES. Omaha Public Power District, Nebraska Public Power District, Grand Island, all those folks that get Wapa contracts, they are all going through this. Again, we're a little bit staggered because it depends on when you signed your contract, but everybody's kind of going through similar type processes. Yes.
How does this IRP affect, or how is it affected by the budget process, the annual budget process?
Good question. So we're doing a 5-year look ahead, right? So that's part of our schedule. So you'll notice that our IRP, the draft, the full action plan, the full report, just a draft because we have to go through all the customer feedback, but that's done by August. Part of that's to make sure we can hit the Wapa timeline. Part of it is to make sure that we have time to put things in the LES budget, because that's about the time we're finalizing our budgets in case we need something for the next year. Now, luckily, LES budgets on an annual basis. So the things that are 2-3 years out beyond that, we don't have to worry about them. But there are things that come out of the IRP that we say, hey, this is something we can hit on quick. We'd like to do some work next year. This allows us to get that in the budget based on the draft plan. Yes, Kim.
But I wonder if you could say a word about to what degree is the IRP planning a compliance exercise versus an organizational strategic planning exercise?
Sure. So the question was, to what degree, make sure I get this right, what degree is the IRP a strategic LES exercises versus doing it just for compliance purposes, correct? It's really both, right? The IRP is the epitome of strategic planning. I mean, it is the pure definition. You're looking out long-term, making decisions that are going to drive your future from a resource perspective for a long time. But saying that, we also get to turn it in and fulfill that compliance requirement. So there's no doubt, even though it's strategic planning, when we get the final report done, Wapa has a checklist out on their website, and we read the report and we actually go through and say, okay, let's just make sure that we checked all these boxes off. It's not that you didn't do the work, it's that you make sure you record it in your report. So when Wapa goes through and does their audit, it actually complies. So we're doing it with an eye on compliance, but there is no doubt this is a strategic planning mechanism. And like I said, if it wasn't required, we would still be doing it for that perspective. Okay, I probably got time for one more before we hand off to Mark.
Back after Mark presentation.
So Kurt, because Kurt's a glutton for punishment, he asked if I'll come back after Mark is done. Either that or he's heard Mark speak before. You know what? Yes, I will be back. So Mark's going to go through his, and then I'll come up and we'll both answer questions. So don't feel like you can't ask questions on this anymore. It's all fair game. All right. Thank you very much. Mark, come on up.
All right. Everybody hear me all right? So we started off with graduate level work and now we're going to go down to third grade with my presentation here. I should have used Crayola on some of these slides here. Really impressive to see this many people engaged in this process. This is really impressive. You know, when you talk about IRPs and energy efficiency, you think maybe 3 people will show up. And this is public power. It's really cool. So thank you for making time to come out tonight. My name is Mark Scholnick. I serve as manager of energy services here at LES. And I get the opportunity to work with a talented group of folks on my staff and colleagues around the company in working with customers on how to best manage energy. And what's really exciting is the technology as that changes and as we begin to see more things come out and are available to help customers wisely use their energy. Because there's so many check boxes, obviously environmental stewardship, but also bill savings. There's just a lot of benefits that can comfort, productivity, all of that. And so it's a lot of fun. I'm going to talk a little bit about, we're going to focus a lot on the sustainable energy program, but I also don't want to shortchange some of the programs that we offer that aren't energy efficiency directly related. And one of those is our net metering and renewable generation program. We're pretty proud that folks in Lincoln, probably per capita, we have more rooftop solar than anywhere in the state, maybe even in the region. I don't know about that, but we do have a capacity payment that we provide to customers. We've had that for about 5-6 years. We have well over 250 rooftop systems, and per capita, that's pretty good. So our net metering, and then we do have a few systems that are about 100 kilowatts, commercial systems that are on rooftops. Maybe some of you participate in our community solar program, where we have folks that buy virtual panels and get the output of that on their bill as a credit when they purchase a virtual half or full panel. We also have a renewable energy credit. So if you want to basically offset your use through renewable energy credits, it's just a simple adder on your bill. And it's very simple and easy to enroll in that online. There's paperless billing for those who don't need to get a paper bill, again, in more environmental stewardship. We've done a lot with electric vehicles, and I know we have a lot of drivers in here that have electric vehicles, and we've done a lot of research. Some of that came out of the IRP. That technology continues to evolve. It's exciting to see all that. And then these are just some of the specifics with electric vehicles. We did a ride and drive last summer. We've done research. We've had grant funded incentives that have allowed us to provide purchase incentives or help with the installation of DC fast and level 2 fast charging stations. And then of course the sustainable energy program. The SEP is all of those up there. The SEP has a designated budget, a designated pool of dollars that are set aside solely for energy efficiency incentives, where a lot of the others are funded in other ways. So I thought that we'd just spend a few minutes talking about the sustainable energy program at a 50,000 foot level. So we're going to do that, kind of an SEP 101, talk about the primary objectives of the program, talk about what the programs are that comprise the sustainable energy program, and then talk about cost effectiveness. In other words, how do we go about establishing what is a fair and reasonable incentive? It is based on a variety of input assumptions, and I want to just talk about that. And then we'll talk about the consultant's review and recommendations for the current SEP. So it's really important, I think, to understand why we have the sustainable energy program. Number one objective is to reduce peak demand, which occurs late afternoons in the summer, okay? That's really important because we can delay the need for another generating resource if we manage our peak right. And that's why we have peak rewards, and that's why we incent those kinds of equipment that run during that, that 5 to 6 p.m. period, so we can delay the need for another generating resource. And also, it buys us more time for new generating resource commercial development for low emitting resource options that are just being considered now, may not even be envisioned now. If we can push that out, we can buy some time to get some of those new generating options where they can be looked at for the future. A second objective is to help with market transformation. Okay, when you offer an energy efficiency incentive, you're not looking to do that forever. You're looking to do that to catalyze the market, to get people into something that they wouldn't do without an incentive. But once the cost of that measure comes down and people begin to adopt that measure, it isn't prudent use of ratepayer funds to continue to incent a customer, right? If you were going to make a decision in the absence of an incentive, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to give that incentive, to continue to give it. You look for new opportunities. You look for new technologies. Okay, so market transformation is a big, big goal of an energy efficiency program. Now, one thing that can transform the market is federal standards and requirements, right? And we certainly saw that with the light bulb. That's probably a perfect example where you had the federal government saying that efficiency of lighting has to meet this target by this year. And that's essentially what brought it into the incandescent light bulb, okay? There was a lot of waste in an incandescent light bulb, 90% to be exact. 90% of the energy that went into an incandescent light bulb was lost as heat. That's why you can't touch it. Now you can touch an LED because it doesn't waste that heat. And so we are making a transformation in that one technology. That's been revolutionary. It's been revolutionary because it's happened in such a quick amount of time. And balance. That's a really important objective. The fact is that a customer who participates in SCP and gets an incentive is obviously getting a benefit. But what about all the ratepayers who are funding that pool of incentives? We need to think about all ratepayers and the participant in the incentive, not just the participant. I've covered some of these just in some of what I just said, but again, we're trying to push out the time that we need another generating resource, allow time for the development of new and low and zero carbon generating technologies. We're trying to tip the market. Incentives are helpful, are meaningful when they actually reduce cost as a barrier. But once they're required, the incentive is no longer required, right? And then the balance. The incentives, if they're set too low, if incentives are set too low, people will collect the money, but it didn't make a difference in their decision, and they're free riders. You really can't count the energy and the demand you reduce because they're still going to make the decision without the incentive. If the incentives are set too high, now you're subsidizing, and essentially all your ratepayers are not getting the benefits, but they're paying into this pool of incentives, and then you begin to subsidize. So it's that balance that you really try to strike in a program like this. So here are some of the programs and when they started that make up the SCP. The residential programs, heat pump and air conditioner was one of the first programs we offered back in 2009. It actually had been offered for a number of years, and then it was suspended for a while, and then it was brought back in 2009. And to date, we've over 11,500 customers have gotten incentives for putting in more efficient heat pumps and air conditioners. And about 9 megawatts of demand have been projected for that. Sealing and insulation. We have a program to provide whole home sealing and insulation, including blower door testing at the end required to make sure that the air quality is adequate, that we can measure the impacts of that, and that the air quality is safe and there's enough air changes. And as Scott mentioned, in 2019, we brought in the heat pump water heater program. And you know, Kurt, you came and talked about that. I'll tell you, the first year, I think we had five. Okay, we have a total of 70 now. It's getting the local trade allies comfortable with the technology, because they're the ones that really make a difference. When they're talking to a customer, usually that customer has a water heater that's no longer working and they really need a new one. That trade ally can make a difference if they're saying, hey, did you think about a heat pump water heater? Tremendous technology, about 50% energy savings for a heat pump water heater. And then peak rewards, which is a demand response program. So notice that the residential programs constitute about $9 million of incentives, and about close to 13 megawatts of demand reduction. But I want you to see how that compares, about 15,000 projects, how that compares to the commercial industrial. The commercial industrial is over 22 megawatts. And we've had incentives of nearly 20 million. So really, these programs have driven the major reduction in demand and the major reduction in energy. And the reason I point that out is commercial lighting, which we also had as part of our original program. Commercial lighting, surprise, surprise, we've seen a slow decline in participation. And what we're seeing is the LED lighting, what you see in here, that is becoming the new normal, right? And so that is a challenge because it's a good thing. It's a good thing that the market is transforming, but the number of projects of large scale particularly, those took advantage of our incentives about 4 or 5 years ago. And when they reach the end of life of their LED lighting, they're going to stick with LED lighting. And the life of those lighting, by the way, is longer than a traditional fluorescent lighting. But you can see almost 18 megawatts just for commercial lighting. And so it's a huge, huge part of our overall demand and energy savings since 2009 is the commercial lighting. And then the commercial and industrial programs comprise the rest of it. So about 2/3 of our demand reduction is from the commercial industrial segment. So I want to transition into how do we go about setting these incentives? We don't throw darts at a dartboard and see where it comes up. We actually go through a process of looking at a ratio, which we call a utility cost test, UCT, where the benefits and the costs have to be equal at worst, and preferably the benefits are greater than the costs. And so the benefits of an energy efficiency program is that when you reduce if you reduce energy need, you're reducing the amount of energy you have to purchase. You're also reducing the capacity you need to generate that energy. And we also include the value of carbon that will be reduced because you're needing to generate less energy. So we take a look at the life of the equipment that we incent, and we take the net present value of all of that equipment, and we put that in as benefits. On the denominator side of the ratio, the fraction, is obviously we have some administrative costs to offer this program. We've got a software system that processes, we've got labor to administer, and then of course the incentives, okay? So what we're looking for here is if we can show that the avoided costs are equal to or greater than, or the benefits are greater to or equal to the costs, then we have something that we can work with, an incentive that we can work with. Yes?
When you talk about costs, these days, are you beginning to think about the costs of climate change, like health and so on? Is that factored in any way?
That's represented in our cost of carbon that we use. We have a emissions cost that we include, and that's the way that we've anchored that is to the cost of carbon. And that we've been using cost of carbon for about 5 years, even though there hasn't been a carbon tax that has been adopted. So that's how we capture that. We do have a secondary test that we use, and we don't expect for it to pass at a 1.0. In other words, we understand that there's going to be a little bit of subsidization where the benefits may not be totally more than the costs. So we accept a 1.0 on the UCT, but if we look at the incentive and it returns a 0.6 or greater on this ratepayer impact measure test, then we pass it through. And the only thing we're adding to this particular ratio is lost revenue, because when energy use goes down and demand goes down, there's less revenue that comes in, but we still have fixed costs we have to pay for. So there is some level of pressure on rates. So we still have to recover some amount of revenue to cover the things that go into making this a reliable system. And so this ratio, this cost effectiveness test takes into account the lost revenue, but we do not expect a 1.0. Nothing would pass if we did. And these are tests that were adopted in 2017 after we went through the IRP and had a consultant look at this. I'll pause before I go into the consultant's recommendations for any questions you might have about anything I've talked about, the programs, the cost effectiveness test, the high level objectives. Okay, I assume that you're with me and everything's going well here. We brought in Enfront Consulting. The principal, or one of the principals of that consulting firm, actually had worked on our 2017 review. And he essentially was comparing our program to other peer utilities as well as other energy efficiency studies that have been conducted. He looked at our cost effectiveness test to make sure they were still appropriate, input assumptions, and some potential new measures we might want to consider. One of the findings is that the tests we're using, that utility cost test with a 1.0 and the ratepayer impact measure test, the RIM with a 0.6, is still appropriate to use. And they made the comment that the utility cost test is becoming more widely used as a cost effectiveness test across the country. He thought that the report suggested the assumptions we're using for the savings for energy and demand were appropriate. We have a projected savings for each project that we plug in. And they looked at those and they said that those were appropriate and were supported. They did make a comment that we do have some custom projects that don't meet what we call prescriptive. So there's a lot of measures that, you know, a heat pump, an air conditioner, there's a lot of similarity in those, but sometimes you'll get an industrial project and it's kind of unique. And so he provided some guidance in how we might treat those with a little more precision for determining incentives for those types of projects. So those will be helpful in evaluating incentives for those types of projects going forward. Obviously, 2.3% inflation is something I wish we had right now. Obviously, this is pretty typical, but we're going through a very strange time right now with high inflation. But they thought a static inflation of 2.3% is appropriate. However, they did suggest that we were using a 1% rate escalation for our retail rates, suggested that we go a little higher. Now, we've experienced fairly low retail adjustments over the last decade. We have done some shifting of fixed costs from the variable rate, but really the underlying energy rate has been pretty stable and rather low. And they're suggesting just to be a little bit more in line with what they're seeing to consider boosting that up a little bit. The wholesale energy costs that we're using are appropriate. They did suggest that we consider increasing the value of capacity. So a reduced KW may be worth more than what we're currently valuing it. So we're going to look at that a little closer and how we escalate that as well. We are one of the few utilities that actually brings in CO2 into our cost effectiveness model because we value that reduction in carbon in anticipation of some type of carbon tax in the future. And so we want to capture that benefit in our modeling. And so we will continue to do that. They did suggest that we look at maybe being a little bit more aggressive in the later years in terms of what that value may be. So we're going to step back and look at that as well. There weren't a lot of great measures that they suggested that we don't currently offer. That's the frustrating thing, is we're kind of reliant on technology to give us the next LED, essentially. We'd love to find the next LED. What is that in the house? What is that in the business? They suggested we might consider high efficiency humidifiers, commercial kitchen equipment. They thought we might want to look at electric water heater direct load control, similar to what we do with thermostats, but also maybe controlling some of the load on water heaters. So we're going to look at maybe doing something there. They suggested looking at maybe different rate structures to encourage off-peak activity. So we'll look at those things, evaluate them. We'll see where that goes.
Back one.
Yes.
Can you do variable critical peak pricing
Without AMI?
without smart meter conversion?
That's great. That's a good, great question. You really can't.
What's the current company policy on conversion to smart metering?
Well, I don't know if we have a defined policy on it. We currently have,
You have one. The 2000, where's Kevin? 2010 board voted not to go with
Correct.
smart meter.
I think there was a financial analysis done about the AMI meters at that time and the cost of putting those in versus the benefits that it would provide the service territory was not anywhere close. So whether or not that'll be considered in the future.
I'm still sticking to my story.
Okay. Well, I don't know. Is there a policy that suggests that we would not do?
Policy is not to convert,
Correct. That was based on a financial
Not to jump.
analysis.
not to just.
Correct. That was based on a financial analysis at the time, right?
Among other things.
Okay.
So real quick, just to go back to your original question, yes, we can do time of day pricing, variable critical peak pricing without going to AMI. You can program different time intervals and meters. It's not as simple as if you have AMI and all the data is coming back, but it can be done. And Mark, you can speak to what we currently have with all of our
Right.
larger
We
customers,
do,
right?
so we do have smart two-way meters out for our large light and power customers, which is our largest commercial industrial. There's about 250. So we do have that, and we can do off-peak with that group, that cohort. It's a large cohort and they control a lot of load. So we're able to do that. When you pose a question, I was thinking in mass, can you really do it for the residential sector? You really need the infrastructure to support some of these types of rate structures. So you're right about that. This doesn't necessarily envision that it would be the entire service territory either, right? We actually do have an off-peak rate currently that we offer, but you have to have an interval meter to be able to support that. So, I mean, so you're right. You need to have the right infrastructure there. Next steps. We are going to consider these input assumptions that I just showed you, and we're going to consider some of the new measures that they suggested. And we will run those through the models, and we're going to have something to share with you in June as to how that all crunched through our modeling. And so with that, I've covered the consultant's recommendations and some of the high-level objectives. Scott, you want to?
Yeah, very good. So we're going to open it back up for any other questions. Now, before we do that, I want to let you know, if you hadn't heard, we're going to offer tours of the new facility here after the meeting. All right. We've got a number of LES staff here that are able to take you through those tours. If anybody doesn't have time to stick around for the questions and they would like to get their tour started early, just raise your hand and we'll get you hooked up with somebody and we can do that. Now, please, for the love of God, not everybody raise their hand because they want to get out early. Okay. But those of you that really need to go somewhere, let us know and we'll get you started on your tour. Otherwise, we'll see if there's any more questions. And then after that, if you want to go on a tour, we'll hook you up. If you don't want to, no problem. They're perfectly optional. Okay. Any other questions?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Do LES have any kind of plan or vision or interest in supporting improving the infrastructure, the spider web of the grid, by supporting or even encouraging widespread exodus from the grid, in terms of self-sustaining systems? Okay, so I'm going to paraphrase the question for the folks at home. All right. So I believe what you asked is, LES have any interest in helping customers essentially remove themselves from the grid, right? And be able to operate separate from it. Did I get that? That and for the interest of removing some of the infrastructure that LES has?
So as of right now, no, we are still focused on maintaining the grid. And, you know, there's a lot of people that in our service territory, because Mark pointed out, we have a lot of great incentives for it, that do things like their own solar, they do their own energy efficiency. The issue you have today is that's different than completely removing yourself from the grid. Now, maybe someday when batteries get better, or there could be new technologies we don't even know about yet, this could get easier to do. But for right now, most people are doing all their different things, but still being tied to the grid because the grid covers them when their equipment either A, isn't generating, or hey, everything breaks, right? So you've always got the grid there to fall back on. So for the foreseeable future, we think the grid is going to be an important component. Someday, maybe that changes. It's probably easier to change on the residential side. It gets a lot harder for the large commercial and industrial customers that honestly use the most power per capita by the, per person. Those are the ones that would be much more difficult to get rid of the grid because their power demands are so high. It'd be difficult to do it on site. But that's all stuff that people are working on. The technology's coming. Okay, Kurt.
As opposed to looking 5 years ahead, I've been sort of looking 5 weeks ahead. And I know you did a couple months ago a sensitivity study on natural gas prices. I don't know what the high number was on that, but I understand with the Southwest Power Pool, they select resources based on the cost of generation, and we get that cost. That's where our costs come from. Is it fair to say that we're going to see a real shift to coal this summer as opposed to gas, natural gas?
Okay, I got to try to rephrase this, all right? Cover it all. There was a lot in there. So the question was, I believe, the Southwest Power Pool is dispatching generation based off cost, right? And with the higher gas prices we're seeing, do we expect coal to run more in, I believe you said like the summer, right? Did I cover that correctly? All right, so number one, thank you, Kurt. That was a perfect plant for our SPP workshop that's coming up next month, right? Because if you want to know the answer to that, you want to come to that workshop. I think, so when you have the higher gas prices, right? There's no doubt what the Southwest Power Pool, I'm already stealing our own thunder from the workshop. What they do in simple form is they stack all the generation up from lowest cost to highest cost. They see how much load there is and they run all the cheapest stuff first. That's what they're trying to do. Lowest cost, but keep the lights on. So when you have higher natural gas prices, it moves all those natural gas resources up that stack. So they become less valuable. The coal resources typically though in the summer are already running quite a bit. So there's not a whole lot of extra oomph. There's some, but for the most part, the summer is the core time of the year when they're going to run. Where you see it more is if it's in the shoulder months where the coal would historically run lower. If you have really high gas prices, that will bump the coal up a little bit more. So it does have an impact, but in the summer, for the most thing, that's the peak period. Things are pretty well set. The market needs most of the resources at its disposal at that time. Good question. Anybody else before we break out to tours? Yes, ma'am. Good question. So the question was that it's kind of surprising this is only a 5-year process, kind of a 5-year look ahead with that action plan we talked about, right? When in the utility world, 5 years is literally a blink of an eye, because when we're making resource decisions, those are decisions that are going to last decades, not a decade, right? Most of these things you build, when you put a new plant online, you're saying, hey, that's going to be there for 30 or 40 years at least, all right? Very good question. So when we do the IRP, we're looking out 2 decades in the future. We don't go any further because our crystal ball is pretty cloudy at 2 decades already. Past that's rough. But we're looking out 2 decades in the future. Now, we're only making a 5-year action plan because once we get out past 5 years, you say, you know what? I don't know that I need to make that decision today. In 5 years, I'll get another look at it. The good news is, what I mentioned earlier is we are doing IRP level analysis literally all the time. That's what our group does. Every 5 years, we go through this massive process and get with the customers and do a strategic look where we look at everything. But we're always doing resource planning. It's just usually more focused to the decision at hand, right? If you have, hey, here's a plant that maybe is going to go away, or we have to add generation, you're looking at that specific resource mix. What can you actually pick from at that time? Whereas with the IRP, we look at a whole smorgasbord of things. Some of them, right up front, probably not as competitive as others, but we look at all of them. So this is a process we're doing all the time. The IRP is just the big kahuna every 5 years that we look at everything. Does that make sense? Okay. Anybody else before we break out to anybody who wants a tour? Yes, sir.
Follow up to the question about getting off the grid. Is that even possible in the city limit? Your area, isn't it required by code to have an electrical hookup?
I don't believe it's required, but I don't really know the answer to that.
No, water and sewer.
Yeah, I think if you can actually pull it off, you are free to go ahead and disconnect. Okay, anybody else? Well, again, thank you very much for coming. This is a great group. I'll be honest with you. We were a little worried about how many people we would get in person because we were offering it online with Teams, and that's really great for the folks that can't make it out, but it's much more fun when you're actually here in the room with us. And then there was a threat of rain coming, so we were a little worried that people weren't going to come out, so thank you. If you're interested in tours, just come on up, let us know. We'll start pairing you up with people. If you want to come and talk to Mark and I afterwards and ask more questions, feel free. All right. Thank you again, everybody.